Good afternoon. Welcome to the webinar addressing the impact of violence, concrete action steps for addressing interpersonal violence in Pennsylvania. I'd like to introduce Pearl Berman, our first presenter. She is a full professor of psychology at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. She is the immediate past president of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence Across the Lifespan. A licensed clinical psychologist, she has provided treatment for the negative impact of child abuse, neglect, and family violence. Her research studies of the impact of childhood adversity on adult experiences with violence. She is the second author of NPIV's National Plan to End Interpersonal Violence in 3 Generations. She's also a member of the Academy on Violence and Abuse, the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, and the American Psychological Association. She served on the National Committee to Prevent Elder Abuse and received the 2019 Rosalie S. Wolfe Memorial Elder Abuse Prevention Award. She collaborated with the Zero Abuse Project to create child and adult advocacy studies, which covers violence across the lifespan. And she received the 2020 Child Advocacy Studies Award. Professor Berman.
Welcome. This webinar is going to provide you with an example of how different forms of violence may be related to each other across the lifespan. This helps illustrate why we cannot forget the past. There are common risk factors in development that can result in many forms of interpersonal violence. Then we will discuss the impact interpersonal violence has on the individual victim, as well as their families, friends, and communities. Next will be a public health approach to healing toxic stress and trauma. We will end with a discussion of action steps that need to be taken to address interpersonal violence. They just wanted to take a walk. A mixed race couple recently bought their first home and moved into a new neighborhood in an urban area. As they're walking their dog to a nearby park, they suddenly hear loud arguing followed by gunfire. Moments later, they come across an injured stranger bleeding on the sidewalk. One member of the couple wanted to call for help. The other wanted to avoid getting involved. Why did this happen? Why doesn't each member of the couple have the same opinion about what to do? What do you think should happen next? We are presenting you with this scenario for you to think about these questions and put anything you have in the chat. And as the webinar unfolds, we will be discussing the scenario thoroughly and helping you to answer your questions about interpersonal violence. We have many social problems today that cause us concern. The 3 on this screen, which may seem very different from each other, have in common the great human loss to society, the unfathomable amount of money they cost, and common risk factors from childhood. I will be providing you with some background on these childhood risk factors. I will then use a case history to make it come alive for you, how addressing these adverse childhood experiences could have a powerful impact on reducing many forms of interpersonal violence. Growing up with abuse is a guided apprenticeship in how to be abusive and tolerate being abused. Our understanding of the impact of this childhood tutorial comes from the seminal and continuing work of Drs. Felitti, Anda, Nornberg, and others that began in 1998, and that brought our attention to how the adverse childhood experiences growing up, such as the one that you see on this screen, turned out to be the most significant predictors of adult physical and psychological health. National studies show that about 1/3 of us have had no adverse childhood experiences. 2/3 have 1 or more, and there are 11% of us who have experienced 5 or more. Research has shown that as the adverse childhood experiences we have in our past increases, the greater the likelihood that as teens, we'll become involved in early sexual behavior, abuse of drugs and alcohol, dropping out of school, and involvement in the criminal justice system. The more ACEs in our childhood, the greater the likelihood that as adults, we will have developed drug and alcohol problems, that we may experience depression and anxiety and other mental health problems, that we may develop diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. Dr. Felidi's group created this pyramid to illustrate how the early childhood experiences can lead to the increased likelihood of a lifetime of adversity. Our brains and our bodies are flexible and they adapt and grow based on our experiences. Toxic stress in childhood leads to increased hormones flooding the brain. The longer this happens, the more likely it can lead to a brain where anger or fear and impulsive behavior are in more control of our decision-making than carefully thinking things through and considering present and future consequences. The more impulsive, angry, or fearful child is less able to develop healthy social relationships with peers and may become isolated or involved in more antisocial groups. This increases the likelihood of involvement in risky behavior, such as early sex, drug and alcohol abuse, dropping out of school. As adults, they have poorer social skills and more employment stresses, all of which are related to disease, disabilities, and emotional problems. Comprehensively addressing child adversity could stop this negative trajectory. Our past doesn't have to define our future, but we can't expect children to get themselves off this trajectory. I will use the lives of Katie and Johnny, a case composite that I created based on my past clinical experiences to illustrate how the environment they were growing up in, rural poverty, in addition to its direct impact on their parents' ability to provide food, clothing, and shelter, had indirect effects, including attending schools that were supported by low property taxes, living in deteriorating housing, having underfunded social services with large catchment areas in their area, having an unreliable car, having trouble having enough money to put gas in the tank so they could get to any recommended services. Katie and Johnny were also born into families where the parents had poor relationship skills and poor caregiving skills. From birth, they were both victims of abuse and neglect and grew up in an environment where there was violence and alcohol abuse as constants in their parents' lives. Thus, the toxic stress was ongoing in their lives and affected their developing brains. The kindergarten teacher was the first to report Katie to Child Protective Services after noticing visible bruising on her neck and arms. Johnny's abuse was not noticed, but his aggression was, and he was repeatedly punished in class or sent to the principal's office. However, in the first grade, Johnny ended up in the nurse's office after a physical fight with another youngster, and she sent in the first abuse report on Johnny. Child Protective Services did have the money to assess and recommend action to the parents. However, they didn't have enough money to do follow-up, and so the only outcome to the reports were that Katie and Johnny got beatings at home for bringing trouble to the family. If Child Protective Services had been able to ensure that parenting practices actually increased at home, Katie and Johnny might have been able to concentrate in school and see that there were adults in the world who did care about them. Instead, Katie became more depressed, anxious, and withdrawn. Johnny became more angry, hostile, and aggressive. It is important to note that not all the Katies and Johnnies will develop into high-risk adults. They are just more likely to than children with lower adverse childhood events. Some of our high-risk children do receive adequate help from adults and learn how to lead violence-free lives as adults. In Pennsylvania, statistics from 2020 show that adults indicate 37% of them were emotionally abused. 28% came from divorced families, and 26% were physically abused. And it's important to note that these are self-reports. The amount of reports to Child Protective Services is much lower than this. Katie had barely noticed the two boys hovering near the girls' bathroom when she went in. They were boys with bad reputations in school. She had been bullied since kindergarten, and so she was a school isolate. Thus, she left the bathroom alone. This made her seem like a good target for the two boys. One grabbed her and threw her hard onto the ground, held her there while the other began pulling her pants off. At this moment, Johnny came out of the boys' restroom. In an instant, he did think about walking away, but his eyes caught Katie's, and he stepped in swinging hard. In that instant, Katie and Johnny became constant companions at school. Most sexual assault is solo assault and is perpetuated by males, but group assault is more common in teenage males. There are females who commit acts of sexual assault, but they are a much rarer event. About a quarter of all of our sexual offenders are minors, and about a quarter of our victims are under the age of 12. Any youth who crosses the path of someone who doesn't have control of their violence and sexual impulses can become a victim of sexual assault. This person is just in the wrong place at the wrong time. For example, a teen who missed the bus had to walk home in the dark and cross the path of a perpetrator. However, someone with many adverse childhood experiences, like Katie, may be less able to recognize signs that they are in an unsafe situation or around an unsafe person. Neither Katie nor Johnny reported the sexual assault. This is not unusual, which is why in Pennsylvania, we now have a Safe to Say Something crisis center. The center receives anonymous tips from anyone within the school or community. The center then sends information to the relevant school and indicates which students might be in danger of suicide, self-harm, being bullied, etc. At this time, 35% of the tips relate to suicide, 22% to self-harm, and 21% to bullying. This information is just the tip of the iceberg, as most students and staff don't recognize the warning signs of destructive behavior. It's valuable to know who the victims might be and who the perpetrators might be within a school when selecting how to respond. But we need to recognize that violence and other forms of antisocial and destructive behavior are warning signs that a child or youth is being victimized and needs help, despite not asking for it. The past cannot be forgotten in addressing the current problems. The Johnnies in life, caught harming someone in school or on the streets, need help, as well as the Katies. Katie and Johnny were bullied starting in kindergarten. How common is this in Pennsylvania? The Anonymous Pays Youth Survey in 2019 showed that 1/4 of our students were bullied in the past year. 54% said adults took action. And that's great, but then we still have almost half not taking action. Bullying was usually happening on school property. Of those bullied, about a quarter received a physical injury, and about 2/3 were emotionally abused with insults and name calling. In terms of internet safety, about 21% of our students have received inappropriate sexual contact using technology. Not all victims of bullying have high adversity scores, but the Katies and Johnnies have increased risk for being bullied, being the bully, or both. The most common reasons for being victimized were something to do with the way they looked. It could be something changeable, like hairstyle or clothing. It could be something not so easy to change, like their weight, something impossible to change, like their race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. We want our schools to be safe places, but we know that violence is occurring on school property. We can't forget the recent mass shooting in Texas. We can't forget the past when looking at what's happening now. The best predictor of future experiences with violence is having past experiences. In high school, Johnny began hanging out with the same students who were selling drugs at school, as they were the best social fit for him. He was sometimes the muscle for them and was given drugs as payment. Sometimes the pain in their experiences at home were eased when they were high. Their parents had always been role models for the abuse of alcohol. Getting high together was easier than talking together. While together, they didn't feel isolated and alone. Anyone who's looking for excitement and is encouraged by their peer group may experiment with drugs and alcohol. Surveys show that starting in the 6th grade and accelerating with each grade level, youth are being offered alcohol or drugs while at school, making it easier for youth to make an impulsive and serious mistake, especially those with high adversity scores. There were many times growing up that Katie wondered if she'd be better off dead. Johnny was her best friend, and he did protect her from bullying and harassment at school. However, he also took his frustration and rage out against her. In Pennsylvania, we collect self-harm data per 100,000. On the screen, you see examples of Allegheny County, Dauphin County, and Philadelphia, which are the biggest cities in Pennsylvania. And currently, Allegheny County has our highest rate of suicide at 13.5 people per 100,000. People often ask why Katie doesn't leave Johnny. After all, she's feeling suicidal. Rather than separating, Johnny and Katie got married right out of high school. The child abuse ended when they moved out of their parents' homes, but intimate partner violence, which had started in their dating years, continued. Johnny had started out rescuing Katie from sexual assault. He understood they were both victims of child abuse and that they were both still being harmed. Yet now he is the one harming her. Why did their problems continue even after they were freed from their violent parents? Remember the pyramid. They grew up with toxic stress. They lived in an impoverished environment with less help accessible due to low property taxes, large distances, and income inequality. Their parents couldn't teach them skills they didn't know. They did teach them alcohol abuse can be used to decompress at the end of a hard day, and that people do hit each other to solve their problems. Katie's attachment to Johnny was built on her prior isolation and loneliness before meeting him. Her past history of violence made his violence against her seem normal, and his history of saving her from a traumatic sexual assault and constant bullying in school made her feel loyalty to him. While Johnny emotionally and physically abused Katie, she was still his best relationship and her best relationship. Sometimes they listened to each other. Katie would talk about her flashbacks the night her father almost killed her mother. Katie listened to Johnny's stories of being beaten by his father, no matter how hard he tried to get as much work as possible done on the farm, and how angry he was for being helpless. They had a dangerous relationship, but they were each other's best friend. When we try to understand why people don't leave a violent partner or love a parent who's harmed them, we often forget that relationships are complex. In addition, some victims are threatened with death if they try to leave or having their children taken from them. A final factor we need to consider is that past violence against Katie and against Johnny may have impacted their brains physically. Many victims and perpetrators are found to have significant head injuries that make it more difficult for them to control their current impulses and make good decisions. The past violence can't be forgotten in going to today's solution. Does violence and destructive behavior ever stop? Johnny continued his physical abuse of Katie until after driving drunk on his 69th birthday, he ended up in a wheelchair and needed her constant help. However, he still tried to control her using threats of violence and emotional abuse. Sometimes she did as he told her, but now, sometimes she began to hit him back and threatened to push him down the stairs into the basement. He had no real friends to reach out to. 3 of their 4 children had run away from home as teenagers, never to return. Their youngest, Bill, had entered the military and then did return home. However, Bill didn't hesitate to use violence against either of his parents if they irritated him. He also didn't hesitate to demand money Katie and Johnny could ill afford. Again, he used violence if he needed to get this money. Elder abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation doesn't always occur due to adult children who were abused becoming abusive and exploitive caretakers of their now older adult parents. However, if an older adult is harmed or exploited, the most likely perpetrator is a relative. Across the lifespan, this is a painful fact that those most likely to harm us may be those closest to us. Bill had left school. He was earning a good living. He'd learned skills in the military, but he didn't learn the social and problem-solving skills that could help him overcome his abusive past and learn to live a nonviolent lifestyle. Bill's pathway to becoming a violent adult is an example of how the intergenerational transmission of violence occurs. Studies done in our prisons show that across white, Black, and Latino offenders, our incarcerated population have very high child adversity scores. We need to address this if we are to end future acts of violence. Some populations are more vulnerable across the lifespan, even without childhood adversity. Are you different in any way? People who are born with or who develop challenges are at much increased risk of violent crime, and they're 2 times more likely to be a victim of sexual assault. The more challenges a person has, the even higher rates of victimization are likely to have occurred. It can be difficult for someone with trouble talking clearly to make a report that authorities find credible. It can also be difficult for someone who can't get by without physical help with toileting, dressing, and eating to report someone who's stealing from them because they fear losing this critically needed help. Today, there's much more accurate available information about what it means to be LGBTQ+ than there used to be. However, it is still not uncommon for these youth to experience violence at the hands of their parents and when adults from their life partner. On surveys, 56% of this population admitted to considering suicide. 61% admitted to constant discrimination. And as a result, 73% are experiencing a mental health challenge. Anyone who is considered different, such as a new immigrant, someone with cognitive difficulties, is at increased risk of violence. In conclusion, While each type of interpersonal violence brings with it some unique aspects, the common precursors to most forms of violence across the lifespan are childhood experiences with violence or serious family dysfunction. Exposure to violence is our best predictor of future violence. This is because early exposure to violence leads to a cascading set of negative impacts on the person's development. Remember the pyramid. Many forms of interpersonal violence are interrelated across the lifespan. Johnny started as a victim of child abuse, but when bullied at school, he became the perpetrator of peer assault, dating violence, intimate partner violence as an adult, and physical child abuse when he became a parent. Katie was a victim throughout her life. Her alcohol abuse led her to be a neglectful parent until she became more powerful than Johnny as an older adult, where she began to respond to her son the way she wanted to and began to perpetrate violence against Johnny. To effectively impact violence, we need to remember that we must help those who are being harmed as well as those who did the harming. Our next speaker will be Susan Amelia. Susan is an attorney, author, and motivational speaker who's advocated for over 40 years to end violence against women. She has worked as a sexual assault victim advocate and also represented domestic violence victims in divorce proceedings. With the death 23 years ago of her 19-year-old niece, Maggie, killed by her ex-boyfriend, Susan's work became more immediate and personal. She vowed to help women move on after abuse as Maggie could not. Susan is now the originator and facilitator of My Avenging Angels workshops, based on the idea that living well is the best revenge. These have helped hundreds of women take the journey from victim to survivor to thriver. She has also facilitated intervention groups with male domestic violence offenders in both Massachusetts and Connecticut, and presented her work on thriving after trauma to female inmates in Pennsylvania and male inmates in Connecticut and Massachusetts.
Thank you, Pearl. It's great to be here. I want to talk today and sort of add another piece to what Pearl was talking about in terms of the impact of trauma on victims and the kind of traumas and the kind of violence that they might experience. I want to talk more about the impact on families, and starting with the impact on my family, which was as a result of my niece, Maggie, who you can see pictured here, who was a beautiful young 19-year-old college sophomore. She's also very athletic, musical. She was one of those kids that was kind of a Renaissance kid and a problem solver. And she was attending a very good school out in the Midwest in Michigan, and had been involved with a student who was a little older than she was. They had a relationship for a number of months that she broke off. She called him immature, and had some experiences with him that she felt he wasn't the kind of person that she wanted to be involved with long term. Next slide. So one of the things, as Pearl mentioned, I now do work with women, helping them move on after abuse, because he not only killed her, but he killed himself. And so in that process of the idea that how do I get revenge as a family, as me personally, particularly with the background that I had working on this issue, I had lots of issues that I thought could have been resolved, that could have saved Maggie, but those were out of my control. What happened to her was out of my control, but I felt I could find some way to help others to move on as Maggie could not. And I found this when I Googled the word revenge, I found this saying, living well is the best revenge. And I thought that's really what I wanted to do. That's what I wanted my family to do. And I felt that that was the way that I could get back at the situation that had happened to my niece. Next slide. So here's a little more detail about this situation and kind of what was under our control, beside obviously her death and the way she was killed wasn't under our control, but some of the things that I think weren't noticed, some of what the word we use today is the red flags in her situation. This is 1999, this is about 20 years ago. So Maggie was 19 years old, he was 20. She broke up with him, she called him immature. One of the signs that her girlfriends talked about after her death was that she felt he was pushing the relationship too far, too fast. But he had never physically threatened her or assaulted her before he killed her. And for many young women, particularly young women or people in these kind of relationships, the danger becomes clearer when there's physical assaults or physical violence. But there wasn't that in Maggie's case. However, when after her death, I did some speaking at the college where she was killed, and I talked to some of her girlfriends. And when I showed them the warning sign list, the warning signs of a potentially abusive relationship, they're all like, "Oh my God, this happened too. He was verbally abusive. He was manipulative. He was possessive. He was overly controlling. He wanted to know where she was." And when she did break up with him, he constantly called her, emailed her, texted her or her friends, begging her to return. And this went on for quite some period of time. Maggie didn't perceive that anyone on the college campus would help her through this problem. As I mentioned before, she was a problem solver. She thought she could solve the problem all by herself. And so one night he invited her to come to see him in his dorm room. She had done that before. She used to help him with his school papers. And I think in her mind, knowing my niece, she thought she was going to tell him one more time to leave her alone, and then she was going to leave the room. Next slide. What she didn't know is he had a gun. It wasn't an assault rifle, which is more common these days and more available, but he had a hunting rifle, which was pretty easily obtained in Michigan without, I don't think it was even a 24-hour wait. And the gun store owner knew that he had given a college dormitory address. He knew that he was a college student. The gun store owner had no responsibility legally to contact the school, which would have had reasonable cause to search his room and find the gun, but he did not. The gun shop owner did not feel that obligation legally or morally. His friends also knew that he was suicidal that night. Interesting what Pearl talked about is this sort of inclusion of suicidal thoughts and actions on top of being a victim of crime or of violence, and also now a perpetrator. Although he never hit her, she didn't understand that she was in danger. That moment when you leave a relationship is a very, very volatile moment. It's a very vulnerable moment. It's where that person who you thought would not hurt you might in fact go to that place. So the warning signs were there, the red flags, as we talk about them today. Refusal to accept the breakup of a relationship. He could threaten to kill himself if she left and wouldn't return. And that was, I think, difficult for Maggie to accept, that, you know, her leaving would cause him to kill himself. He was obsessed and possessive of her. And I think his mindset was, if he couldn't have her, no one else could. Next slide. So I'm a survivor of homicide. That means that one of my family, someone close to me, someone I love, has been a homicide victim. And so not only it affects families of homicide victims, and in the recent mass shooting in Texas, Uvalde, Texas, I think you can see that if you've watched any of the coverage of it, that the families have the first impact, let's say. Maybe I wouldn't say the greatest impact, but certainly it's hard to judge impacts, but parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, you could see that in Uvalde because a lot of these families seem to have generations of family living in the area. So grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins. Then it goes out to friends and coworkers. Many of Maggie's friends were very, very, very upset about this and very had a very adverse impact. They were also young. They were in their 90s and 20s and had never had this kind of experience before. Neighbors of my brother and sister-in-law who knew Maggie for years and years, grew up with her, had an impact, fellow students, teachers, the immediate neighborhood, the surrounding community, and then the larger community. Although Maggie's death, which was about, Columbine happened in the spring of 1999, Maggie was killed in the fall of 1999, because it wasn't technically a mass shooting, which today is defined as 4 or more people who are killed as a result. Because only she and then the perpetrator, although they usually don't count the perpetrator in that number, was not a mass shooting. So we didn't get the national, but in the community where she was killed, people still talk about what happened to my niece and talk about how the school did or didn't respond. So there's a larger community. What the impact of that violence and trauma is shock and turmoil and guilt, anger, and as I said before, the need for revenge. And for some people, although they don't understand it initially, post-traumatic stress and depression, and they go through the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and acceptance. And what I've learned about those 5 stages is they don't go in order, that in fact, you could one day be in acceptance and then something happens and you bring yourself back to anger. I certainly can get triggered back to anger and depression every time there's a school shooting anywhere in this country, which now is pretty frequent. Then, although we didn't have to deal with the police because there wasn't a long-term criminal prosecution of this man who killed himself, but that's something that homicide survivors really have to deal with. And not only homicide survivors, but anyone who's a victim of a crime who reports it. And coming back into the court system is going to bring back all of that and all the trauma. Begin to cope with loss. Holidays are still very hard 20 years later for us. And sometimes people talk to us about, do you ask me, do I forgive this man for doing what he did? And I consider forgiveness the F word. I don't need to go there. I don't mention his name. I don't talk about him except in the context of what happened to Maggie, to have people understand the sort of dynamics. But it's hard because that loss is there. And there was certainly an impact on his family also. But coping with that loss comes back to you at times you don't expect it. And then finally, what's good or bad in your family and your marriage will all come out. The good things about my family were the things that got us through. And then the hard things that triggered people back to some previous traumas were the difficult things. So it's just hard to be on that plane where all this will not affect you. At the same time, you want it to affect you in some way because someone that you loved is not only gone, no longer part of this life, but was killed in such a violent, unexpected way. Next slide. Oh, so you're going to go back, Pearl. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that I did mine. So what I wanted to say about this sort of more broadly in terms of what we're talking about today, in preventing violence, one of the things that I've thought a lot about in looking at the kinds of impacts on my family and her friends and the students that are around here is that certainly there should have been more advocacy and awareness on Maggie's campus now 20 years ago about these kinds of red flags, warning signs. Nobody reported him, particularly his own friends who believed and saw that he was suicidal that night, possibly more suicidal than homicidal. More education of students, more education and training on the campus of employees, how to deal with this. And we certainly are seeing that in the Texas shooting, that people are looking at each other and trying to figure out who knew what and how this might have been avoided. And not just in terms of the impact on the person who's the victims, but also the other children that in that school and the trauma of it. Certainly looking at student on policies and student conduct, the way the school deals with people who have tendencies or show red flags for perpetration. And then finally, the presence of guns, which since 1999 and Columbine and my niece's murder has become even a bigger and bigger issue. Like I said, Maggie was not killed with an assault weapon, but today that seems to be the assault weapon of choice. There are some federal regulations and laws that impact this, particularly on the college campuses and schools. Title IX does cover discrimination on the basis of sex. My niece was murdered because she was a woman, and she was deprived of her education. That's a violation of Title IX. However, some regulations have been changed recently on Title IX that to not include physical forms of abuse and some of the ways that colleges deal with perpetration, which would allow the school to deal with it before it goes to a more serious and final end, which would be what happened to my niece. Today, my family is doing well. We have our moments. I have this work that has inspired me and keeps me going. And I do believe that living well is the best revenge, and that the kind of work that we still need to do on trauma and the impact on trauma is not only important, but crucial for all of us to be able to move through the kind of issues that we face, and sometimes the issues that we're not sure are coming towards us, and how we might cope with it and help the people around us to cope. Thank you. Pearl, do you want to introduce Megan and Karen?
Megan Garza, MA, LMFT, is a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified trauma care supervisor, and American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists board approved supervisor with 20 years of experience in the mental health and violence against women fields. She is a graduate at Pepperdine University with a master's degree in clinical psychology and marriage and family therapy. She received a second master's at the University of Missouri, St. Louis in psychology. She is co-owner and therapist at Healing Reflections Therapy, Diversity, Trauma, and Wellness Services in St. Louis, Missouri. She is on the advisory board of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence and is former president of the St. Louis Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Megan has spoken at national conferences on sexual trauma and PTSD and has published and edited peer-reviewed research in the area of trauma-informed care and sexual abuse. Karen Rich, LCSW, PhD, teaches and researches in the area of secondary victimization, rape, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and institutional responses to trauma. Her research has focused on police responses to rape victims, interdisciplinary responses to sexual assault, interpersonal violence against people with disabilities, and secondary victims of campus rape. She is active on several trauma-related boards, conference planning groups, and intervention teams on the international, national, and local level. She is pleased to be a longstanding member of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence's board and practice action team.
Thanks, Pearl. Well, hi, I'm glad to be here. Now, one of the biggest questions that often gets asked is, why should I address this trauma? Like, shouldn't we just kind of leave it in the past? It was done, it was over, can't we just move on? And that's a real struggle, because honestly, what has happened in the past is very much still present and active today. As Pearl talked about earlier, with ACEs, with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, we know that the events from the past has an impact on someone's health today. And to the extent that there is a direct cause and effect relationship between adverse childhood experiences, those things that happen in the past are very much affecting your present health today. And even to the extent where we know that people who have, I believe it's 6 or more ACEs have they live on average about a 20-year shorter lifespan. Their health is impacted across all domains that they've been able to measure. So we know that it's really important for us, for our health, current day health, to consider how important it is to address trauma in the present, because it is still active. We also understand, and part of that is recognizing the generational impact. Those things that happened from far in the past are still present today. Recent research in epigenetics with Holocaust survivors has gone to show us that in the genes, we can look and we can see how our genetic profile, the way the genes are expressed, gets changed after trauma. Holocaust survivors, the next generation of Holocaust survivors is changed after experiencing trauma. So trauma does change from one generation to the next, and not just experientially and socially, but also genetically. We know that there are a lot of different impacts from, as again, Pearl gave a great example earlier, talking about how when you grow up in an environment that there's a lot of struggles, it's going to impact the next generation and then the next generation. And it impairs your ability to be able to have enough resources to carry forward for the next generation. And then we also know that healing is not time limited. So healing is something that's going to take, it takes as long as it takes. So it's not something you can, put a cap on where it's been 6 months, where it's been a year. Healing often, healing is something that's going to take, sometimes it's a lifelong process of helping people to find their best selves. So trauma matters. Addressing trauma in the present, it matters, which is why we're going to talk a little bit more about the impact of trauma. Go ahead and flip to the next one, and Karen will pick up on the next slide.
Hello, I'm Karen Rich, and I'm going to pick up on the topic of what is trauma. So when we refer to trauma, we're referring to an event that's outside the range of normal human experience that causes someone to fear for their life or the life of somebody else. And the list that you see on the slide are some examples of this. And in addition to those characteristics, the situation overwhelms the individual's coping capacities. So when we think about it, one's coping capacities may vary by age or experience. So what traumatizes me may not be the same thing as what traumatizes you. But the trauma is the reaction that the person has in their mind, their emotions, and their body. So typical effects of trauma include isolation from other people, re-experiencing the trauma, perhaps in the form of flashbacks, dissociating sometimes from trauma, from triggers of trauma or reminders of trauma. Dissociation involves spacing out and sort of leaving one's body, which is a learned response to inescapable terror. In addition to those key components, there are other factors that may or may not happen when someone has been the victim of trauma, one of which is memory impairment for the traumatic incident, self-harm to manage the effects of trauma, such as to manage dissociation or the re-experiencing of the event. Self-harm can be helpful with that. Self-medication, which can be through food, through alcohol, or any other substance. And the effects can include emotional dysregulation or the inability to modulate powerful emotions of anger or terror that can occur. Next slide. So these are some of the warning signs of trauma, and I believe that I've sort of mentioned them as part of the symptoms of trauma, but sudden unexpected anger in certain situations, incredible distrust in a situation where that normally wouldn't be expected, fearfulness, Other things for children can include not wanting to change when they go to gym, not wanting to be visible, which can include not wanting to stand in front of the class. Children can feel like the trauma is somehow written all over their bodies. So some people wear very big coats or try to, in other ways, hide their bodies. Some people are truant from school because they're afraid to be seen. There are so many different indicators of trauma that you have to be open to the possibility that any student may be experiencing trauma when they exhibit a sudden change in behavior. Next slide. So trauma-informed care has many facets, and we want to use trauma-informed care in the institutions that exist to help survivors. So that includes hospitals and schools and criminal justice organizations, any place where people may go, including homelessness shelters, etc. So in order to provide someone with trauma-informed care, it's very important that the staff are knowledgeable about trauma so they can notice some of the symptoms that we've been talking about among the clientele. So every single person, not just clinical social workers and psychologists, but every single person within the institution would need to have some basic understanding of the symptoms of trauma. And in addition, somebody should survey the agency and look around and say, wait a minute, based on the fact that people coming in here have a history of, say, domestic violence, maybe we shouldn't have all this screaming and yelling taking place. In other words, to look over the institution and to say, what are some things that are happening here that could actually set somebody off who has a history of trauma of the type we're here to actually help with. So one of those things, in addition to that, is to eliminate triggers if you can in the environment once you identify what they are. One way to identify them is to have somebody who has a similar history, who may be a client even, to walk around and talk about things that are in the environment that could actually set them off. And sometimes you can't modify everything, but to try to modify as much as you can in the environment and in the protocols. For example, medical organizations are now requiring less disrobing because they're aware that sexual assault and physical assault survivors may be uncomfortable in a situation where they have to disrobe for medical procedures. So now it's done only when it's necessary in the more trauma-informed medical facilities. So changing things around to make them more comfortable and to feel more safe for the clientele is important. In addition, offering choices. So the feeling of helplessness and powerlessness that survivors have during the incident can translate into feeling that way in a helping situation as well, especially if they're being asked to talk about it. So giving them as many choices as possible can help to mitigate that. So choices can include, if possible, the gender of whoever is providing the service, the timing of the service, the location of the service, and even the methods being used where there are options, and really letting the client know of the various things we're asking you to do here, which ones are optional and which ones are absolutely essential. So for example, a client that is terrified of injections might be told that you don't actually have to get an injection or a blood test. You do have to sign a disclaimer, but we're giving you the option to not do that if it's something that is that upsetting to you. And we will still provide you with medical care. Another thing that's important is the ability of the client to provide feedback. So clients are not necessarily going to voluntarily comment on the services they're receiving. They're more likely to just leave and never come back and be considered non-compliant clients. But if they're asked, what are the things happening in this organization that make you feel better and safer? And what are the things that we do here that make you feel threatened or less likely to return? Clients are more likely to respond if given that opportunity. It's important to have members of the client population on the board if you can. And another part of trauma-informed care is that one size does not fit all. So flexibility with the protocols is very important. And last but not least is cultural competency and disability awareness as well. So treating people of different cultures with a kind of sensitivity to their norms and expectations can be very helpful in terms of trauma-informed care, because people have often been the victims of trauma because of their differences, right? So they may have been bullied, or they may have been excluded, or subject to different types of abuse. They may not actually count as physical violence, but it's considered institutional violence. These people may be particularly sensitive. And what this does, this focus on trauma-informed care, is more like to retain clients. It reduces dropout. Having staff supervised and trained will reduce the amount of burnout that they experience. So the staff benefit and the clients benefit, and the service provision is likely to be much more effective when these protocols are observed. And the last thing I want to mention here is secondary survivors. So Susan O'Million talked about being the secondary survivor of murder, right? So somebody in her family was murdered, and she then becomes somebody with secondary trauma. So the same thing happens with people whose family members have been raped or bullied or victimized in other powerful ways. And what happens is those people, the loved ones of the survivors, have their own set of symptoms. So a truly trauma-informed agency will provide services to those people as well. Because when those people are given services, particularly if they're parents of children, the primary survivors are going to do much better, because they will have people around them that know how to respond to them appropriately and help them feel safe. So trauma-informed care is a buzzword that you hear a lot, but it's got a lot of complexities and a lot of components that are really important to focus on if you are an administrator of an agency. Next slide. Which will be Megan Garza.
Yeah. So thanks, Karen. Now, that begs the question. So we understand what trauma is and some of the impact of it. How can you help? This is often the struggle that people get in. So there are a few things with just understanding about just the impact on the body. We want to be able to regulate the impact of what is happening to you physiologically when you're impacted by trauma. Either and this could be if you're the person directly impacted by it, or if you're a helper, if you're a family member. There are lots of different ways in which self-regulation is important. You can do this by offering a person a glass of ice water to regulate their body. This hits on that the vagus nerve. That vagus nerve helps to re-regulate and set the system. So it kind of helps, it helps to ground the person back in the present. Deep breathing is also something. So we often talk about helping connect somebody to there's different kinds of breathing. You have breathing in your chest, and then you have breathing in your diaphragm, what we call belly breathing. So taking deep breaths into that belly. So where you're moving your hand, not so that the hand on your chest moves, but so that the hand on your belly moves. And doing a series of that, several real nice, deep belly breaths, and going through coaching with them. There's a lot of different kinds of breathing exercises where we have square breathing. So you can counting to 5, as you're breathing in, holding, exhale, holding, and kind of going, like you imagine yourself making a square as you're going through that process. There are different ways that you can do breathing exercises, and there are lots of different apps that can take a person through on the steps of doing that. But you also want to just kind of help the person stay in the present moment. So help the person kind of be mindful about where they're at, trying not to get them stuck back in the past about what happened, but be in the present. So anything that helps ground them in this present moment where they're at right now, with you, where they are safe, reminding you're here with me, you're safe, you're just notice the things that are around you here in this office. Notice the lights, the sounds, take a mint, put it in your mouth, just feel your feet on the ground, feel your feet in the shoes, just notice what's here in the present. encourage them to you're going to want to listen without judging. So a lot of times people, they just want to be heard. So not asking why questions, not interrogating them, just give them space to tell you what they need to tell you, and bear witness to their pain. So silence, being a silent observer in that way, and just hearing them out and validating what they're saying. Like, that's awful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing that story with me. Like that. I can't imagine what that was like. Like I really appreciate you sharing this with me. Now, you also want to give them space to talk if they want to. Thank them for sharing. Accompany them to a safe space. And we also want to help them get set up for doctor's appointments, lawyers, advocates, therapists, help refer them to other professionals who can help. Look up any resources and offer ideas for coping skills, and get yourself help for any indirect trauma that you may be experiencing. Okay, we can go on to the next one. Some places where you can get help. You can get help from the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. RAIN.org is really good for finding sexual assault resources all across the country. There's a Valley Against Sex Trafficking. National Center for PTSD has a wealth of resources as well, where you can learn different treatment methods for recognizing symptoms, signs of PTSD, medications that are helpful. It's a great resource. And the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has a lot of really good tools and articles for helping out children and families who are affected by trauma. And then, as well as this link on how to get help is helpful with local resources in Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. And in terms of how to prevent trauma, so things you can do in terms of preventing trauma, there's preventing trauma in the current moment, and then there's the preventing trauma in the past. So listen to your gut, watch for warning signs of danger. That's one of the things that people really struggle with is, what do I need to do? So recognize those signs of when things are dangerous. Put up signs for no-hit zones. This idea of a no-hit zone is where essentially where we we have no smoking signs in hospitals. No-hit zones are this idea where we put up signs in hospitals where we're not hitting children, we're not hitting others. So revolutionizing and normalizing it. Hitting is not okay because hitting is traumatizing. Avoiding triggering social media content. That's one way of preventing trauma and triggering trauma. In terms of bystander intervention, offering a distraction, getting someone to focus on something else. And we also encourage people to tell and keep telling until you get the appropriate response. A lot of times the people who you're going to might not respond in the way that you want to. And in terms of how to prevent trauma, in terms of just the internal response, really make sure to use a lot of those things to take care of yourself with getting a good night's sleep and trying to make sure that you're eating and find humor, gallows humor, if so, find humor and laughter, watching stand-up comedians, connecting with family and friends. Social relationships are essential for self-care. And find a place of safety, find places where you can go to for safety, and practice things like yoga, meditation, and deep breathing. All these things are going to be helpful for in the moment and afterwards with preventing trauma. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to the next person.
Joyce N. Thomas, RN, MPH, PNP, FAAN, is a national and international pioneer in child welfare, victimization of children, and domestic violence. She is the president and CEO and co-founder of the Center for Child Protection and Family Support in Washington, D.C., and director of Children and Family Institute in Silver Springs, Maryland. She's providing leadership for quality services to children and families. She's also on the board of the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence Across the Lifespan.
Good morning, and thank you for paying attention to this very, very important educational program. What I'd like to do is talk about public policy, what makes it effective, how each person has a role to bring information and services to their community. Public policy really is a way to solve overall policies and also problems that may be in the real world. They are guided by various concepts. You hear and see a lot about public policy through our government agencies, through our state agencies, through many, many of our large institutions. Next slide. We talk about issues of violence, and as was discussed, there are many, many interpersonal violences against children that occur. But as we think about what we can do as citizens, as individuals, it's important to understand trauma-informed care and trauma-informed services. This is necessary so that all institutions, whether it's the law enforcement system, the healthcare system, the schools, are all dealing with that very sensitive person who has been traumatized in order not to make it worse and also not to make it repeat. Think about the messages that have been said. You know, we have to make sure we interrupt this pattern, but without interrupting it, we start to see variations in individuals who have experienced trauma in their childhood and in their early years. Policies determine who gets what services, where these services are provided, and when they're available. It's an important part of our social calendar of tools to address the society's needs and the society's must-have. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the healthcare system. We have certainly seen how unfortunate incidents in recent times have brought violence right to the door of the healthcare system. And as we think about health providers, myself being a registered nurse with a long history in pediatrics and adult care, we're there to help. But the system around us, the hospital policies, they must focus on really mitigating the effects of trauma, because we see so many clients, so many individuals, so many patients that come to us who've had prior experiences of trauma. So as we think about this in our communities, and we think about this in terms of policies, we must ensure that the healthcare system is designed to address understanding the ACEs, as it was discussed earlier, the adverse childhood experiences, as well as thinking about what can we do to prevent further trauma to the individual. Next slide, please. So we identify these policies, and we really want to promote informed mental health services in our schools. Hospitals are one, schools are particularly important because this is where an awful lot of trauma and recently has occurred. And it is expected that, and I'm hopeful, that those individuals who've experienced this trauma will have a new thought about a trauma-informed system. That is to look at their own policies and look at how these policies and these experiences can result in toxic environments if they're not addressed. So we have to think about toxic stress, and that includes stress for preventing extreme violence, extreme incidents of repeated trauma, in order to build resilience and in order to address the needs of individuals within the institution. Next slide, please. So as we think about policies, we want to recognize that policies that promote trauma-informed policing, again, is extremely important. Unfortunately, when violence occurs, it occurs in many, many arenas. And so often the first responders may have to come on the scene in a crisis situation. And it is important to refocus and understand what you're doing to ameliorate the immediate problem, but also to not add to the problem by further traumatizing individuals. Obviously, these policies must be able to, particularly with law enforcement, to serve justice and engage citizens in very positive ways. Next slide, please. Keeping again with the institutions, we know that again, there are situations where when an incident, crisis may occur, a trauma, a violence, whether it's gun violence or whether or not it's domestic violence, many times these situations present themselves beyond the police to the court system for decision-making. Again, its focus is to make sure that all along the way where the individual who has experienced the violence is in a situation or in an environment that is protective of them. So prosecutors also need to have a basic understanding of trauma and how it affects individuals to be better able to serve them as well as the victims of crime in a humane way. These policies are needed to provide guidance for prosecutors to assist them to incorporate trauma-informed best practices in their work. And this would enhance the need of really crime survivors, witnesses, people who have been accused of crime, and the entire community. So we're advocating today for, first of all, understanding violence and trauma, looking at how to prevent it, looking at how to treat it. And now as the bystanders or the individuals in the environment, what can be done to, again, to minimize the extra trauma that may occur, and what can we do to move toward resilience and making stronger individuals to confront these issues. Next slide, please. And that takes us to the community. The community is really where policies, all policies really kind of gravitate from the bottom up. Community policies that address trauma of child abuse absolutely must keep in mind the background of those children, the history, the historical trauma that they may be experiencing or may have already experienced. It must be individualized to make sure that their gender, their race, where they're located, and even their language. No one person's going to have all of these skills, but if you're working in a community, you really have to be keeping in mind what is the best way, the most sensitive way to assist individuals who have experienced trauma. Next slide, please. So policies that promote public awareness, policies that have education for communities can help to create safer, healthier environments and provide effective strategies for building resilience. Within the last several months, we have been overwhelmed by the large amounts of violence in our communities. And there is a tremendous effort for pushing for legislative changes, which may be policies or public policies at the national level. We certainly see that these policies are also extremely important on the state level, but they also are important on the individual community level. And this means bringing people together, getting consensus, discussing the ramifications of what has happened, looking at ways and strategies to move forward, and also to begin to look at healing and resilience. And this is what we want to build. So if future incidents may occur, there really is this need to recognize what to do. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, individuals and communities must demonstrate an active role in allocating resources. It does take time, it does take money, it does take resources of all kinds, whether or not it's meeting spaces, whether or not it's opportunities for developing programs, opportunities to provide training. All of this involves the community. And so the community really must have a firsthand look at how to promote resilience, to understand trauma, to rule out adverse experiences that may have occurred with young people or even older people, as was discussed. Trauma policies that promote information and informed care in their jurisdiction is what we're seeking to accomplish. Next slide. So I've tried to just walk through these issues of policies, but there's a number of areas and a number of places that we can go for information. And having been involved with the National Partnership to End Interpersonal Violence, there are trainings, webinars, programs, there are individual practitioners, there are action groups where we are constantly looking at and really trying to establish effective ways, best practice ways to reduce the stress and trauma that individuals might have. Whether we do this through our direct services with a client or a patient, whether we involve our institutions, our healthcare systems, our educational institutions, our law enforcement institutions, our courts, all need to be informed about trauma-informed care. And certainly we know that this is an ongoing effort, and this effort really brings us to making it a part of our everyday life to understand. So training is necessary, education, public awareness. And our hope is that as we look at the public awareness aspect, that we're able to do this on all levels throughout the country, because people use different forms of media to get information. And so we have to examine ways of getting the message out that we really want to reduce trauma, the impact of trauma, and certainly to promote resilience and to design systems and policies that are safe. Thank you.
We are now in the question and answer period of the webinar. So if you had any questions, please put them in the chat. And we're going to start by talking about the scenario that we introduced at the beginning of the webinar, our mixed race couple who are walking their dog and unintentionally crossed the path of a case of street violence. So does anybody have any questions that they would like to ask about why one member of the couple wanted to call for help, but the other wanted to avoid getting involved?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why, because of their background, their differences, even though they may have a lot of similarities, their history might be a factor to, and their prior victimization, all of those may be factors as to why one of the individuals in the couple wanted to move forward and the other may have been hesitant.
I think it's also about fear of retribution, getting involved in the court system, just some sense that there's not just this moment, but what something long-term might be in terms of their involvement and commitment.
Yeah, it could be about their safety in that moment. Do they feel like they're not safe in that moment and they need to prioritize their safety in that moment? Are they worried about their, do they have a past history of trauma, and are they just, more worried about seeking safety, or are they worried about what might happen if, what does that mean if the police come, and what are their experiences with the police? And if they are there and present, what does that open them up to, or what does that open their family up to? Yeah, I mean, it could open up a lot of different doors of possible trauma or re-traumatization.
So people often ask, why do bystanders not help? And I think our speakers have addressed there's many different reasons why people might be afraid to or hesitant to reach out to help. And when I first read this scenario, what I was most wondering about was, why is this person dying on the street? What happened to this community member who, even as we're hesitant and we're deers in the headlights and not responding, what is happening to this person that their life is now in jeopardy? In the weeks following the event, one member of the couple noticed that their partner's behavior had changed significantly. They no longer wanted to walk the dog or leave the house. This person was more jumpy, irritable, sleeping less, and seemed to be less patient with the dog. This person kept wanting to be physically close to their partner and get emotional support. The other partner seemed to want more distance in the relationship, both physically and emotionally. What's going on with this couple?
Well, they're
ahead,
responding to the trauma in different ways. And this is something that's commonly seen, that each individual interprets this trauma in their own way, and which will make them want to either move further away from even hearing about it, whereas the other person may want to talk about it over and over again.
Yeah, and I think that highlights, I think that's very important, about understanding trauma, is that everyone's going to have a very different response to, to the impact of trauma, that it might look different from one person to another. There's certainly a different spectrum of responses.
And there's a lot of change that have clearly gone on in this couple's life. They've just bought their first home. They might be less economically secure because of the investment a new home creates. And then all of a sudden, there's another shakeup at the relationship. And the trauma is now, unfortunately, pushing this couple apart instead of allowing them to comfort and support each other. The distant partner had been experiencing a lot of pain and set up a time to visit the family doctor. While waiting in the noisy waiting room, there is another patient crying. Instead of completing the paperwork, the distant partner is staring straight ahead with a far-off gaze. A staff member approaches, puts a hand on the distant partner's shoulder to check if help was needed. The distant partner responds by violently tossing the staff member's hand off and yelling an obscenity. Another staff member sees this interaction and decides to call the police, further escalating the conflict. The distant partner is now informed they are no longer welcome and must seek medical care elsewhere. What are people's thoughts?
Well, this healthcare facility, this clinic was certainly not trauma informed. This is just the opposite. If the staff were aware of what has occurred, first of all, some people don't like to be touched, and others really do need a hug and a strong hug. So again, it's reflective of the institution, and such policies in the institution need to be developed in order to help staff know how to intervene in a way that's most appropriate and accepting to the clients.
Yeah, and it highlights, so like the stomach pains, you're seeing like the somatic response to trauma. So that like how trauma can be held in the body and the different responses, and seeking healthcare, but also how like this healthcare settings can be triggering and re-traumatizing in and of themselves, and how we need people to recognize how someone can be re-triggered, but just by being there and asking permission, asking for consent, before approaching someone, before touching them, but simply not understanding, not getting a sense of like what's going on, and simply banning them, doing a blanket banning them from the agency. And now you have some people who are, like, because of things that were no fault of their own, they're going to be struggling and needing services. But maybe if they're living in an urban area where, their services may be far apart and distant and few and far between. Where are they going to access those services? How are they going to get to them? Do they have transportation? It makes things much more difficult for this family to access services that are much needed.
We've now come to the end of this webinar, but we're not at the end of our questions about what do we need to do in our country so that people can go and shop at a grocery store and not fear being shot, so that people can send their children to school and not fear being shot, that children can go and adults can go to a medical center and not see their doctor and nurses shot. So to learn more about how we can build a resilient community where people know how to effectively take action to prevent violence, please attend our next webinar. And thank you so much for attending.